We have to talk about the roommates, what they saw before they called 911, and does this change anything within the story? All that being said, everything's alleged. Welcome to The Point. Let's get to it.
Let me start here, though. In my business, we're laser focused on learning every detail and filling in every blank about a gripping true crime case. But sometimes in this process, our hearts just get broken all over again each time we learn something new. And so it is with the University of Idaho. Since the case moved to Boise with a different judge, we've seen a blizzard of unsealed, unredacted court filings and a regular supply of details and disclosures, even some bombshells.
And in terms of the bombshells and how they've affected anybody's perspective, I don't necessarily hear anything that is 100% pointed towards one way or the other. Now, the information about the sheath is a big deal. It's highly important. It does point towards guilt if other things within the story do line up. But there has been other aspects of this story that have came out that hasn't necessarily pointed towards guilt. There's issues with the timeline. There's issues with the car. There's issues with the narrative. There's still issues with the whole reason why all this happened. And honestly, we've had a ton of misinformation as well, with individuals making videos and putting out stories that Bryan's family's not supporting him and they're going to work with the state to prosecute Bryan. So to sit here and say that these couple of pieces of information as they came out 100% point to guilt is not a fair take in my own unprofessional opinion. But we've often asked the question, how did the roommates not see anything? How did the roommates not hear anything? And how did the roommates not smell anything? And we're getting some insight into that information.
And tonight, two absolutely stunning revelations about the surviving housemates texting and talking in the wee hours of November 13th, 2022. Also, a rare peek into some grand jury testimony, something we don't often get to see. We knew that Dylan Mortensen, a surviving roommate, had texted an Uber driver just after 2 o'clock in the morning. That's about 2 hours before the murder happened. But now we know that she and three of her roommates, Bethany, Kaylee, and Maddie, all of whom had just arrived home from a night out, had actually contemplated going out again. The court document reads, and I quote, "At approximately 2 a.m., they met up in Kaylee's bedroom and talked for a while before going to bed. The fifth roommate, Xana Kernoodle, who was out with her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, was not home yet. The roommates debated going out to the food truck for late night snack, prompting Dylan to send a text at 2:10 a.m. to an Uber driver she knew to see if he was driving."
And this does give us a little bit of answers into that particular part of the story. There were a lot of us who wondered, why did she text somebody at that particular hour after she had just returned back home from the night on the town? It didn't make sense, but in this context, I do believe this does make sense. This is a valid, logical explanation. She just wanted to go out again, and they wanted to go out again because they were all just dumb college students. They come in and they go out. They'll go out again if there's something else going on. I mean, there's multiple reasons that students do this.
Ultimately, however, the girls decided to just go to bed. Man, that brings to mind a lot of what ifs, doesn't it? What if they'd gone back out? What if they just decided, let's go, let's do it. It's 2 a.m., let's go get more food. Might that have changed the course of history?
Or what if they would have done what most of us would have done regardless of what we did that particular night? Which is, when you see something strange, you see something odd, or you see something that's scaring the pants off of you, which is what this story is, you call 911. Now, does that mean somebody's life would have been saved? It's been reported by many people that no, it wouldn't have changed anything. But I strongly disagree with that, because in crimes like this, seconds matter. And I don't believe having an opinion like that means you're railing against the roommates, or you're being insensitive, or you're being callous. If, for example, she would have called 911 when she was so terribly freaked out, there's an avenue that they would have caught the suspect a whole lot sooner, and it may have eliminated a lot of this mystery. They would have found the individual who was in the white car with all the evidence in the car. There would have been no time to destroy any piece of evidence, and a lot of that could have eliminated all the issues we're having right now. But that's not what happened. They didn't call 911, and they waited several hours later, and the first person they called after they were on their phones all morning was 2 other people.
On that horrifying night. Of course, there is a good chance if they'd popped back out to that food trunk that they still would have been home. before the knife-wielding intruder, allegedly Bryan Kohberger, broke in and killed Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan. But we will never know. And that brings me to the second revelation. We knew about Dylan and Bethany's frantic text messaging between 4:22 a.m. and 4:26 a.m. when Dylan tells Bethany that nobody will answer their phones and that she's afraid because she saw someone in a ski mask. And we knew that Dylan then ran down to Bethany's room on the ground floor of the 3-level house. But the court documents now reveal a brand new fact that we never knew. And it is, honestly, it is something horrifying. Again, quoting Dylan. Dylan again tried calling Kaylee and Xana, but neither responded. Dylan then exited her room and began running towards Bethany's bedroom. On her way, she noticed Xana lying on the floor of her bedroom with her head towards the wall and her feet towards the door. Dylan thought Xana was drunk. Once Dylan arrived downstairs at Bethany's room, they locked the door and both made additional unanswered calls to the other roommates. Hours passed, and at 11:50 a.m. the next morning, 6 minutes before the 911 call that you have heard on this program, Dylan called her friends Emily Allant and Hunter Johnson because she was too afraid to go upstairs by herself. And the court filing reads, Emily and Hunter met Dylan and Bethany at the bottom floor of the house. Together, Dylan, Bethany, and Hunter started to walk up the stairs to the second floor. When they reached the second floor, Hunter went to the kitchen to grab a kitchen knife. Now, this next part is from Dylan's grand jury testimony. When Hunter came back out, Dylan said, quote, she saw Xana again for a split second, and this is Dylan talking, and just started bawling because she thought she had just like, I don't even know. I thought maybe she was still just drunk and all asleep on the floor. Bethany also saw Xana lying on the floor. Hunter told Dylan and Bethany to, quote, get out. Emily, who had started up the stairs, also turned around after Hunter instructed her not to come any further. They both went outside shortly afterwards, and Hunter exited the house and then told them to call 911. He was pale, white, and mentioned something about someone being unconscious.
Can we stop pretending like that makes sense and that's okay? I'm not saying the roommates had anything to do with this particular attack, and a lot of people are saying if you're saying anything critical about the roommates, then you're being insensitive, and that's just nonsense. It's okay to have an opinion in this country, and we need to stop pretending like this is okay. This is normal. This is typical behavior. It is absolutely 100% not typical behavior. And it's a problem for the state because their narrative is these roommates were out that night and they were tying one on, which we've talked about in the past. But Dylan's the one that saw the bushy eyebrows in the description of who they believe to be Bryan Kohberger. They talk about frozen shock face, her running down to Bethany's room, locking the door and being completely freaked out. But then they're not calling 911. They see the roommate laying on the floor and they do not call 911. I'm sorry and I hate to say it, but if this was a scenario where the two surviving roommates were guys and all this played out the way it's playing out, those two dudes would be in jail. That's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree down in the comments below. But it was Kathy Mabbitt who said this was a horrific scene. So how are all these people instantly realizing that whatever happened that night, it's a big deal, somebody needs to call 911, but these two are not? I get it, everybody's going to say, well, they were drinking, and you don't know how you would react in that situation. And I get that I'm grown now, but even as a kid, when I tied one on a little bit harder than I should, in situations where I should have been freaked out, there's a thing called being scared sober. When you get that adrenaline rush, it allows you a moment to think clearly. You know, that whole fight or flight, what do I do? You can't say she was in shock because she was still texting her other roommate while she was in shock. She had the wherewithal to run down to her roommate's room and lock the door. She saw what happened. She saw one of the roommates. That doesn't make sense. It's a problem for the state. She's either fully aware of what's going on and she knows what happened that night and they didn't call 911, or she's completely blasted out of her mind and her eyewitness testimony is garbage. These are issues for the state. I'm not saying they had anything to do with this particular crime. I don't believe they had anything to do with this particular crime. I currently believe they're just two sheltered individuals who had no idea how dangerous the real world was.
You can hear a lot of that. You can hear a lot of it on the 911 call. We just envisioned that the banging and the calling out, Xana, Ethan, was at the bedroom door, but it may not have been. It may have been down the hall and around the corner at the stairs. This is where I'm going to stop and bring in Steve Goncalves. Steve is Kaylee Goncalves' father. He's been a regular guest on the program. Steve, these were details that I found astounding. They seemed to put into place more details of a very confusing picture of what happened that night. And I often stop and I think about you.
I'm sorry, real quick. The only thing confusing that night in terms of this whole particular part of the story involving the roommates was the roommates' actions. That's fair to say. That's not saying I'm being mean or insensitive. That's just very strange behavior. Like it or not, that's just my point of view on it.
And the other parents. And whether you get a heads up that this stuff is coming, whether you have someone who sits down with you and goes through it and helps you to sort through it, how do you receive this kind of information?
We normally get an email beforehand. We work back and forth. I don't think either party really had an understanding of how to really construct something where you can share information but not too much information. But the communication's gotten a lot better. I've really grew to like these guys. I mean, I really care about that those people and all the work that they've done. So I think they've always tried to work towards communication, but I'm sure they're very busy, and it's not easy to always remember to keep us in the loop.
Mm-hmm.
It was a surprise to me, Steve, to hear this detail that Bethany got a glimpse down the hall of what now appears to be Xana's open bedroom door, and Xana lying inside that bedroom door, and ran downstairs to Bethany's room. And then at one point, Bethany also saw that same image. But it's sort of just, it's flummoxing to think that they called friends, they called 911 before anybody sort of went to investigate what was happening in that bedroom with the door now open. We always assumed that it was closed and they couldn't get past it.
Yeah, that's definitely a puzzling part of it. But I always assume, you have somebody who's scared, girl, intoxicated. My own daughter, when my son was playing a prank on her, acting like he was being attacked, him and his mom, Kaylee ran upstairs and hid under the bed and called me at work. So when people are scared and they're young, they don't think the same way as a grown adult does. And I think they were just thinking that something bad had happened, but they didn't want to believe it. They weren't really prepared to mentally accept what was happening. And
Look, they were sheltered, they made a bad decision, and I believe that's perfectly fair to say, and that doesn't mean one thing or another. They just were who they were, but they were not kids. Let's stop calling them kids. At best, say young adults. They weren't small children, they weren't people in middle school or high school. But even primary school kids understand that when there's something bad going on, you call 911. And that just wasn't the case here, and that's one of the reasons people are having an issue with the roommate. That doesn't mean they're targeting them or any of that nonsense. We gotta quit being so linear in our thought here. There's a whole lot of gray with this story. A lot of what we thought we knew very early on hasn't really panned out to be true, to include this new information right here. A lot of us have said they weren't aware because the door was shut so they couldn't see inside the room, but we know that's not the case. And it's very confusing how they were obviously aware something bad had happened that night, since they were so freaked out they could see inside the room, which by the way the walls were leaking, but they still didn't call 911. That will not make sense to me, and I do not believe there's an explanation that can make that make sense.
I totally understand that, because it's not something that we're used to in Idaho. It's not something that is common. It's not even, it's just unheard of. So
that's not an excuse.
To that, and I know that there's a lot of forensic, and there's a lot, these girls had their phones on. I already said way back in the day that you could tell when they went up the stairs and downstairs. This is all laid out. Every step has been retraced. So it didn't make a difference in the bigger picture. And I've always said that there could be blessings for late calls as well too.
Yeah. It's also just so jarring to get the detail that the girls were all together up in your daughter's room, chatting about, let's all go out again, 2 o'clock in the morning, let's go back to the food truck. And I'm not sure if you heard how I laid it out at the top of the show, but all I can think of is the what ifs, if they had actually decided to go. And I'm wondering how you're processing that information.
I knew a little bit of the details about that. I don't even talk about some of it just because I don't want to hurt some of the people, that are involved in this. If, certain people would have picked up phones, all those type of things, those are what ifs. But I think what it really goes to your audience is these girls were best friends. And even the last moments of my daughter and Maddie's, they were surrounded with friends and they were in their beds. So just keep that in mind, because there's going to be probably some people are going to try to drag these surviving people through the mud. And up to their very last moments, they were hanging out with these, the people who passed away, planning on doing something fun. And my daughter came down there to hang out with one of those girls. And that's the reality of it. That's the truth of it, not some of the speculation that you're going to eventually hear about.
Yeah, and shame on those who have cast aspersions on these 2 surviving roommates.
Honestly, I don't believe having an opinion that they should have called 911 or should have been aware of what was going on means you're casting dispersion or dragging them through the mud. I mean, if you think it is, you can let me know down in the comments below, but I don't know what to tell you. That's just my take and my opinion. You have yours, let me know.
Who have been to hell and back. They're still there. They're not back. And how anyone could set upon them with ridiculous conspiracy theories is beyond the pale. There was something that you mentioned, I think a couple of days ago in an interview that sort of stood out to me. And that was that I think you had a chance to speak with the coroner and got a detail about one of the injuries that your daughter suffered at the hands of this, I think it was a punch to the face. Can you tell me what it is that you learned?
I don't go into all the details on it because I want the court to bring it out. I want them to do it. But yes, I feel 2.5 years. The defense has a strategy to have everybody forget. And I'm here to make sure they don't forget.
The defense's plan is to prove Bryan didn't commit this crime. Their plan is to prove the holes in the state's case. They're not out there to make people forget. I honestly don't know what he's talking about. And even if you're one of these individuals who want justice for those 4 individuals, which I'm one of those people, you should 100% want the defense to do their job. And you should want them to do their job to the best of their ability. You should want them to try to poke holes in anything and everything possible. Because that's how we get a fair trial. And when you get a fair trial, you actually get justice. So him railing against the defense and making the statements that they're evil or something along those lines just doesn't make sense to me.
So when I do have to let stuff out, it's because I don't want people to forget that we have a monster. And yes, one of the girls was a little more intoxicated. He was able to go after that. Maddie May first, and my daughter woke up and he struck her multiple times and broke her nose. And and there's
horrible
more
crime
details to that, but I leave that to them in case that's something pertinent for them to know and to let them release it. But I'm not going to let anyone forget about what this monster did. And I'll leave it at that.
But they were able to give you that detail that that Maddie first and then went after Kaylee second?
Correct.
I think there's a lot of forensics that we're going to learn in this trial. I hope you're going to be okay, you and Christy and the family, when it comes time for those testimony days. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, Steve, is that you've learned that Bryan Kohberger called out from work the day after. What do you know about that, and how did you hear this?
There's a thing called a Bryan tally I've heard about. I've spoken because I was vocal, because I came out. Some people reached out to me. This individual was an employee of WSU. And from there, I learned of some details. So Yeah, there was an investigation, an HR type investigation, and I don't know all the details about it, but I do know these girls felt very creeped out. They talked to people in power, and they said document it, and they started documenting it, and that's how we know that one of the days, the day after he took that photo, where he's acting like he's super confident, got away with. He doesn't look sick to me at all. You guys can look at, your audience can go look at it themselves. And I heard that's the only time you ever called in sick as well.
Honestly, he looks sick to me. He looks like an individual who has anemia. The thing I want people to remember is this is a highly circumstantial case. And all these tidbits of information as they're coming out, can they point to guilt? Can they point to Bryan being the individual who committed this crime? Yes, they can. But that story can just as easily be woven to prove he didn't do it. That's the problem with highly circumstantial cases. Storytelling will determine if Bryan is guilty or innocent. That's just my take.
That's unbelievable detail. Steve, I always am very appreciative that you take the time to speak with us. I'm glad you keep your daughter's memory alive and the story alive as well. It's important that nobody forget what happened. Thank you again for this.
Yeah.
And there you have it. The roommates saw Xana. They were aware something bad happened that night. In fact, when they went up there that morning, they started breaking down, crying hysterically, but they still didn't call 911. The only thing that's making sense with the roommates' action that night is that it just doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean they're guilty of a crime. That doesn't mean that they were co-conspirators. It's just another oddity in a story that still has a lot of oddities. The surveillance footage looks like the vehicle changes. They can't tell us if the DNA on the knife is primary or secondary transfer. We have a lot of holes, we have a lot of questions, and everybody needs to be open-minded as this story unfolds. Everybody needs to wait until we hear all the evidence, both on the state side and the defense. None of this 100% points to Bryan being guilty of a crime, and none of this 100% points to the roommates being involved in a crime. They were just dumb young adults. They made a very poor decision. And I'm sure to a degree that's a decision they regret. I'm not dragging them through the mud, and I'm not going to railroad them. But I'm more curious to hear about your thoughts. And if you enjoy this and a more fair, open conversation, maybe check one of these videos out. Y'all be safe now.